I am unashamed. What about you?
So I guess we talked about 2 podcasts in a row. We might as well make it 3, because yesterday you had to run off to town, but Dad had the rest of what was left of those ops he caught.
How were they?
Oh my, they were so good. I hadn't had fried
thumbs
Opelousas in probably 2 or 3 years.
That needs running today, so I've got it timed where every time you run out, I don't have one net, but it's a doozy.
It's a good one.
Well, I may have to go take a look, be a part of that.
Take a little look.
We'll tell you a story maybe.
Well, it was funny. So, Jace, I get over there, and Dad, by the time I get over from here, I mean, he's already mealing them, and the grease is, going, which was great because I was in a hurry. And so Mom had left, gone to town or something. Well, she had tried to delay the catfish because she wanted to eat some. So she sends Dan to town to get some sandwich stuff for Dad, and then left a note for Dad. Well, Dad never saw the note, or Dan, so I was glad because I was thinking,
sounds like a poor note placement to me.
She had it over there in the kitchen, but I don't know. Did you see the note, Dad? I never asked you if you actually.
I remember you. I don't know. They have words for it. Senile.
Well, you have a master's degree in English.
Well, he's trying to be nice.
Your mama hit about 75. She can't remember what she said 5 minutes ago, 5 seconds ago, really.
We've noticed.
So it's no problem. I'd wear it.
She's very jolly about it, which is good,
Yeah.
But so anyway, I tried to call her so I ate some fish and took a couple of pieces with me because I had to roll, burnt my roof of my mouth, which ran out of the grease. So, which is, bad. But, so I was going to call her and say, boy, I sure enjoyed those fish, and I was going to tell her we ate them all, because she, and just, get her going. But she never answered the phone. I couldn't get her.
Well, I called her 3 times on Mother's Day. She didn't answer the phone.
No.
Oh, yeah.
So a week goes by. She came to Mia's little graduation parade. So I said, well, I'm just going to act like that never happened. And I said, well, happy Mother's Day. And she's like, oh, yeah. I mean, it was like I gave her a card. It's a week later. I was like.
But it was like, that's the beautiful thing about her forgetting that.
Did she realize that it's been a week? She honestly didn't care. I saw no sense of.
No, because in the old days, if you didn't call her, like you heard about it.
She did recognize. She said she had her phone off for a few days. She said, oh, I forgot that I turned my phone off for a few days. I thought she was going to say a few hours. A few days.
Well, she was with her favorite son, Jep, on Mother's Day. So I think that's all she needed was
I will say her one goal in life in her mid-70s, what she constantly makes sure of throughout all we're going over here to this one now, we got to run her. She's got an assistant that goes with her now that does the driving, And
yeah, good idea.
But anyway, she has one underlying goal that never fails. Do I have the man something to eat?
Yeah. Phil needs to be fed.
Do I have something that he eats?
That's
a noble quality.
It is.
Yeah.
So another thing, Jace, I thought was interesting. I just found out because we talked about Mayhaw jelly, I think last time we did, or a few podcasts ago. But Phyllis, our sister, has now transitioned because she and Tony, when Dad was doing the thing, he showed her what to do, and she watched last year too. And then she actually made the Mayhaw jelly, and I had some, and it's just like Dad's. I mean, it's delicious.
I monitored it. I first just showed her, and she'd watch it. I said, now it's time for y'all to see if you could pull it out. She said, I think we can do this. I said, all right.
She had her son and daughter-in-law there.
First, they got on their hands and knees, picking them up, picking up the Mayhaws. So they got them a pretty good little bit. She said, what would this make, you think? And I said, about 20 pints.
Yep.
I just looked at the pot. She said, how would you know that? I said, when you make it long enough, you'll know. So I showed her how to take the berries, bring them to a boil, mash the berries, get the juice out of them, how much water to put in the pot, make sure you get nice and flavorful jelly. So I turned her loose. I monitored. I'm watching every move they make, the amount of sure gel, how long, 1 minute, and when it comes to a foam, let it go down, add your sugar, bring it back to a boil, go 1 minute, 60 seconds, got to be looking at it, little pat of butter, and one little dash of lemon juice, and I'm going through the thing here. But so then I sat down, and I watched how they were doing, and then I'd give a little advice from time to time. But she started.
Was she nervous?
No, but she was.
I bet she
making
was.
sure she wasn't.
She's a little nervous.
I mean, you've only been doing that about 50 years. I'd hate for you just to be right over my shoulder.
Well, I thought it was
made
funny.
it easier for me, and then I watched the first batch out, and I said, I tell you what. Then I'm watching hats set up, and all of it setting up when they were sealing the jars, and had to show them how to get all the microbes off the lids, and the boiling water, and so I said microbes. You got to remember, no one has ever fallen ill over eating our jelly, not one.
That we know of.
But you don't want any microbes on them lids and all that. You got to keep it clean.
So I noticed, though, that they didn't have 100% confidence because they wrote Thomas on top of all the ones that they did just in case it didn't turn out well. They didn't want to just mix it in with
bold move.
That was pretty bold. But I actually broke my diet and had a biscuit with that on, and it was fantastic.
It's crazy. It's occurred to me that, Phil, down here, you once famously said that down here you are 911. But you're also the CIA. You're also the FDA.
That's right.
You're
every letter.
You're in your own little world down here.
I've tried to be. I have made it my ambition, which that means what do you want out of life? Live a quiet life. You say, what?
First Thessalonians.
Quiet life. Mind your own business. That keeps you off the internet. So
it's
much easier to live a godly life in Christ Jesus. I'm going to go out on a limb here. It's much easier if you never have a cell phone and computer stuff in with the mix. You're way better off if you want a quiet life, mind your own business, work with your hands, so you won't be dependent on anybody. Right. It's a lot easier if you don't go through the ravages of the computer world.
But to pull off what you've done, you will.
I hear there's a lot of cursings and carrying on.
A lot of but you got to have a Dan to really complete what you've managed to pull off.
Dan
you haven't unplugged from the world, thanks to Dan.
He gives me information. He got off the internet that is pertinent for me to see. He said, you got a note here. So Dan, he keeps up with all that.
That's right. He's good. So I do want to mention that Tony, being the very talented artist, because they made this Mayhaw jelly, he started a new series. I think it's TonyThomasArt.com if you want to check it out. And he's got a painting that we're going to show of 4 jars of Mayhaw jelly, and it's beautiful. I mean, it looks just like this jar of jelly. So he started a new series. So check that out. Also, I want to mention one thing before we get into our study. There's a lot of pro-life opportunities, I think, that are coming down the pike now because we're kind of waiting on this Roe v. Wade deal. And I want to mention a group that's they're called the Reliance Center, and Lisa and I spoke out in Idaho. Heather's is the girl's name, and she has got something going on out there. So I know a lot of times some of you are looking for some place to give or support the pro-life movement, and I highly suggest them. And Kate's going to put up the URL. It's myegiving.com, and then there's some slashes there. Who'll give you that? But, great cause. These people are doing great work on the front line. So, and get engaged and get involved, because this is a moment, I think, for our nation. I think Dad has said it before. I think we've been under a curse.
No doubt.
Since the 70s. So I'm hoping the curse will be lifted.
Empires have fallen. Many empires have fallen by the way they treat their children.
Yep.
They slaughter their babies.
The Old Testament's full of it.
Full of it.
Terrible stuff. So anyway, we want to.
Who was he? The god of
Molech.
Yeah,
Molech.
They threw the children down the ravines. I mean, they had them burned. It's a sad story of.
Well, there's a lot of different ways to
what
get involved.
evil is like. It manifests itself in many ways, but slaughtering your own children, you're destined to collapse as an empire.
It's terrible. And a lot of ways to get involved. Jason and Missy are doing it right now. There's foster care, there's adoption. There's working on the side, on the abortion side. So a lot of good opportunities for sure. Anything else, Jase? Did you have anything before we launch into Colossians?
No, but when I was reading this Colossians, I mean, you realize, I mean, he has this beautiful depiction of who Jesus is. And we said it was almost like a song from 15 through 20.
20 or 20, yeah, 3 or so.
And then all of a sudden he gets unbelievably, or believably, I guess, personal. Because then he said in 21, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he's reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish, free from accusation, if you continue in your faith, established and firm, not moved from the hope held out in the gospel. And we said this earlier, it's kind of a reminder of 1 Corinthians 15, where he reminded the Corinthians of the gospel. You're like, how are these people forgetting Jesus? I mean, it's not like we're talking about the world here. I mean, they had heard the gospel.
Right.
So what's the problem? These other people had come in and brought up different teachings and philosophies that he called hollow and deceptive. So the question that hit me is, where are you at without Jesus? I mean, where are you at without Jesus?
It's the bedrock, your question. Where are you without Jesus? It's the bedrock from Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, all the way to the Corinthians. We covered that. Now you get to Colossae. It's the same story. The bedrock is always laid as the foundation before he goes on and says what he has to say.
Right.
He lays the groundwork, and the gospel is always at the centerpiece. All our listeners, you need to go start with Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, go on by that. And you say, just look at every epistle, for the Gospels, which is rightfully said, 4 different men writing the same story over and over and over. The bedrock is being laid. You have to have it there like that in your study of the Bible.
Right.
Well, when he gets to the
one
end,
of these epistles right there on the front end, like Colossians here, it's right there at the centerpiece.
Well,
since the day you heard it, not long and drawn out, high theology, nope. Since the day you heard it, it was covered in just a few hours.
Yeah, it was always the starting point. Hang on, let's take a break. Well, we've been talking a lot on this podcast about getting older. Now that, Dad, you have 4 children who are grandparents. And so as we get a little bit older, what happens to our joints as you just kind of live in life is they just don't work quite like they used to. When your body produces SPMs when you're young, your joints are healthy. As you get older, it produces less. And so we need a little bit of help. Omega XL tells us we have 360 joints from the neck down to the feet. So that's a lot of opportunities for some joint pain, Jace. So we want to be able to help that. And the reason and the way we do that is a company called Omega XL, and they help rejuvenate joints and muscles like when we were young. And so, Dad, you and I take this product. It's been a great blessing for us. It's a supplement that comes from New Zealand, and they make it from muscle oil.
Yep.
And it's very good. It's the only thing Dad takes. If you go online, omegaxl.com/Phil, you're going to buy a bottle, and you're going to get a second bottle for free. So it's a great way to check it out for a couple of months. I promise you, you will be glad you did. omegaxl.com/Phil, or you can call them 800-844-4888. That's 800-844-4888.
Well, when you'll get to the end of the book of Colossians, and I found something interesting. We've made reference to it before, but he said after you read this letter, then you go to Laodicea, which is right up the road. I don't know the geographical distance, but pretty close.
It was, less than 100 miles, I think. It's like 15 miles.
That's somewhere up around where this Colossae, where in Turkey, up in there around Turkey somewhere, let's see, modern Turkey. Yeah.
Well,
100 miles east of Ephesus.
But he said, well,
Modern
read this
Turkey.
letter in Laodicea. Well, when we read in Revelation, so I just had I was going to say a funny thought, but it's not funny because it's scary. But the letter to the church in Laodicea, which was right down the road from Colossae, this is where the lukewarm water was. I think Colossae, I remember that's where the cold water, so I guess it was up in the mountains, which was, good for a nice drink, I guess, on a warm day or ice. I mean, you're thinking it was something good about that.
That's also why the earthquakes kept getting these cities.
Well, then you had the hot springs, was whatever city that Laodicea was in between.
Hierapolis.
Yeah, Hierapolis.
There were the three right there together.
That's it. So, but I did think about this. So he writes this in Revelation. John, has this vision, and he says, "These are the words of the Amen, the faithful and true witness. I know your deeds. You're neither cold nor hot," which goes to that. He kind of made a geographical illustration to a spiritual problem, and he says and it's kind of frightening because he's like, "You're lukewarm," which literally makes the Lord sick. I'll spit you out of my mouth.
Right.
And you say, "I am rich and I've acquired wealth and don't need a thing," but you do not realize that you're, wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. Because what the question I ask is that's what you are without Jesus. I mean, you can't be rich without Jesus, because everything that you have will either be given to somebody else, burn up, be lost, including your whole life. I mean, so there's no true riches. That's why I think he mentioned several times in Colossians riches, treasure. Right. Jesus is the
I'm not
treasure.
a good enough historian to know. One of y'all may know. But if you go there in modern day, today, Islam has taken over pretty well the whole
region,
Middle East. So the warnings were there. The bedrock was laid at Colossae, but now if you went over there, there's a surge of people coming to Jesus over there right now as I speak.
That's true.
Mostly refugees that are coming through Turkey. So we're having a little rebound here, but so I don't know when the Muslims rolled in. I mean,
Muhammad was around 600, 500 to 600 is when. That's when his revelation or whatever.
So all these warnings here, he's trying to warn them before it comes, but they looked up one day and whatever happened to Jesus, to your point.
Well, they were putting, worldly things in front of Jesus, and he was kind of admonishing them to look for pain, actually, perseverance and trials, and to get their eyes right. He said, "So you can see," because they had become so comfortable. Well, the point I was going to make...
I guess they were part of the Roman Empire, I would think, at the time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, in fact, the Romans rebuilt those cities twice in the first century.
The point I was going to make, though, is in this paragraph in Revelation is one of the most famous passages in the Bible. And he gets to it and says, "Here I am." Jesus is red letters. "I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with him, and he with me." That verse has probably been used in more altar calls and invitations of any other verse.
Yeah, more songs written.
But it hit me. And I found it funny. I kind of laughed out loud when I thought about it. He's knocking on the door of a church. That they're in there and they've shut him out.
That's true.
And Jesus is knocking on the door saying, "Hey, if you hear my
you're right. We've always illustrated that as being your heart, like the door of your heart. But you're right. In context, it was the door of a church.
There's still...
theoretically.
It's my understanding of these wars we just had in the Middle East over the last decade, but there were little vestiges of Christians still over there in modern day Turkey. There are a few, and
and
a lot of them were slaughtered, during all these wars we had, and then a lot of them were fleeing to Turkey. So now, but there are a lot of them still being converted there, but there were old school religious
a lot
groups.
of Greek Orthodox.
Oh yeah,
is one of the prevailing ones that kind of hung on through there.
Yep.
To be honest,
in fact, I think they should have listened more carefully to what Apostle Paul is saying.
Obviously.
But you had churches set up that heard the gospel, and then in this case, I do think it was because this was a booming city. It was very. I mean, they had a lot going for them, and they just the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth. It's kind of like that third heart. And they just put Jesus on the back burner. Right. And that's why the theme here...
That's modern day America, by the way, Jason.
Well, that's why I'm bringing it up. I see a lot of similarities here because this is not... We usually always think, this is... These people out in the world need Jesus. Well, there's a lot of churches that need Jesus.
Well, that's true.
Because most of the ones...
sounds crazy.
Well, he how can he be any more graphic? He comes to the church, Jesus himself, and says, look, you're making me sick. I'm literally vomiting at what I'm seeing. And so I'm knocking on the door saying, no, what about me?
Plus, think about this, Jase. Think about the time frame. So these were written around 60, and John's Revelation is somewhere, most scholars think between 90 and 100. So you're only talking about 30 plus years.
Yeah.
And you get that challenge that in that much time, they've already lost sight of who Jesus is in these churches.
Oh, yeah.
In Revelation, which is pretty amazing.
It just made me think, though, when I saw that word, when it says that Jesus made us holy to be presented holy in his sight without blemish and free from accusation. Well, who is known as the accuser? The evil one. And what usually happens is we tend to think of the evil one as some Hollywood depiction, some character with a red with a pitchfork.
Right.
But actually, when you go back to the garden and see how he functioned, it was through deceit. It even says he was more crafty. He's crafty. Mm-hmm. And the way it all went down, it was a justification, and a lot of the things that he was promoting was actually good. Even Eve, when she finally took the fruit, she looked at the good. She's like, it's good for food.
Yeah.
She has a desire
for wisdom.
So that her emotions were, and it makes you smart.
Yeah.
Well, he masquerades as a child of light. He
Yeah.
masquerades.
Well, and he uses counterfeit miracles. It's like you change. All you'd have to do, and just to give an analogy, if you went into a store and you wanted to buy a duck call, since we made duck calls for years, and you're thinking they're going to be $39.99, whatever, and you go into a store and unbeknown to you, somebody has put a sticker on it that says free. Well, you're like, that's awesome. This is my lucky day. I've got a free duck call. And since it's free, I don't even have to send it to the cashier. Just
put it in your pocket.
Because somebody put a sticker on, so you could justify that in your mind and feel pretty good about it. Mm-hmm. Now, did you steal? Did you steal that? When people say, well, you should have known. Well, what if the store was just promoting, saying, here's a free, but somebody else put a sticker. And I think it gets to the evil one, he doesn't make you sin. It just gives you a situation. Because he did lie when he said, you won't die. That was just a lie.
Yeah.
And so when I read that,
but it was actually a partial truth, because he could say, well, I meant you're not going to physically just fall out from me. See, exactly. That's the way he does it. It's half truths and just enough truth in a lie to make it sound reasonable. But how many times do people fail because of that? Let's take a break.
So what I'm saying, if you pick out all the negative things, because he reminded them, he said, you were alienated from God. You were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But before you think these are just people way out in the world, I mean, it doesn't matter if you're in a church building and you've listened to the lies and you're under this delusion and you're being deceived. I guess my point is, very few people are out there recognizing this alienation and they're an enemy of God. It's not that simple. It's kind of like the garden. Oh, well, I mean, did God really say? Well, what did he actually say? So you start questioning, you start going through, and there's deceit is involved, counterfeit. Even when you see magicians, I mean, what's the whole deal? They distract you by looking at one thing, and they're actually doing the trick.
It's an illusion.
But I've seen some of them. I'm standing there looking at them, and I couldn't tell you.
And you're trying not to get distracted so you can really see it, and you still miss it.
And every once in a while, there's just a thought that thinks, does he really have some kind of... Because I was looking right at the guy.
Did he really make the statue?
I know it's fake. And, I mean, it's kind of like if you got a counterfeit $100 bill. What do you do with it? That's a tough one. Somebody paid you $100, and then you go, you know how they always look it up, look up in the light. Well, what if they said, you know what? I'm sorry, sir, this is counterfeit. What are you going to do?
Out of 100.
There's a temptation to go try to pawn it off somewhere else is in the real world. That's $100,
Yep.
You got duped, and you experienced all the joy of this temporary getting your money. And now you realize it's fake, so it compounds the problem by you trying to get your $100 back.
Most people would harp on the unfairness of it. You're right. This is unfair. But that's the thing about it. When it comes to evil, there's nothing fair.
Yeah.
The evil one doesn't play fair, and he never has. It's interesting, Jase, because he talks here about the gospel, and then he says, this is the gospel we heard that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, which we talked about before. That was the whole purpose of these writings that Paul's doing is to keep reaching beyond. But I jotted down kind of some verses.
They were told, every one of them.
Right.
They were all told.
It at least got out.
Yep.
And this is all done fairly quickly. But, you were talking about the garden, Jase. Genesis 3:15, we get the first glimpse just after what Jase just described happened, that there would be born of a woman. There was going to be reconciliation.
Seed of a woman.
Seed of a woman. Reconciliation was coming. And then when you follow the path, because when we started this podcast, we did an Old Testament survey, because you get to Genesis 12 through 15, and then you see that seed line through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So we see that going forward. Zechariah 6 says there's going to be a prophet, priest, and king. There's a shoot that comes up out of Israel, again, pointing to Jesus.
Yeah, Isaiah said he was like a root out of dry ground.
Exactly. So, and then Isaiah 53 says he just gives you the picture of what it's going to look like. Listen to these. Psalm 110, verse 1, there's going to be a high priest that mediates in heaven. Psalm 16, there will be one who will be resurrected from the dead. His body will not see decay.
Yep.
Psalm 6:8, there will be one who ascends into heaven to return the same. I mean, these are all Old Testament prophecies thousands of years before it happened.
Yep.
Pointing to the one. And then when Jesus got here. So, when you think about it.
He made the path to Jesus. He made it clear.
He made it very clear. And so therefore, in Romans, no one is without excuse. You can't say, well, we didn't know.
But I think that's why I think it was all based on deceit. I mean, the reason I went down this road, and obviously as I kept reading through it, if you jump to chapter 2 and verse 4, a word's going to stand out to you now, because he says, I tell you this, so we'll have to back up and read what he told them after I read this. I tell you this so that no one may deceive. I tell you this so that no one may deceive you by fine-sounding arguments. Well, who does that sound like? You go back to the garden.
Yep.
There was a lot of fine-sounding arguments. But when you kind of break them down, you look at what God offered Adam and Eve. I would say tens of thousands of trees that they could say yes to.
Mm-hmm.
One no. There was one no. Well, they weren't thinking about the 10,000s upon 10,000s
of yeses.
Because once they said that one yes, well, then they lost the tens of thousands of yeses.
That's right. Got kicked out.
And which is the consequences. And you say, well, what was the common denominator there? Deceit. So then he says it again in chapter 2 and verse 8. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy. Well, who's that sound like?
Mm-hmm.
Oh. Which depends on human tradition and basic principles of this world rather than on Christ. I just thought it was worthy of note that he's talking to church people here. They had lost their way, and to think that the evil one doesn't work in that capacity, or like you can recognize it.
Yeah,
it's hard to recognize because you're deceived. That's how you get off point. And once you're deceived, then you'll even argue and get around other people around you to give support to your hollow and flawed arguments.
Yeah,
that's what happens.
No, you're right. And us being Christians, believers, disciples, when we see what goes on in the world, you said this many times, Jase. I mean, it shouldn't shock us as much as it does, because that's what blinded, unbelieving people look like. That's what they do. They don't realize they're being deceived by the evil one. They're not our enemy. The evil one is our enemy. And he's just got control of their hearts and minds. And so, we see the way people behave, and we're all just shaking our head thinking, how do you go in and shoot up a grocery store full of people? You're just like, it's so evil.
Or they scream, and they are so animated and to kill their children.
Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense,
infants. Right? You said, why would a group of people scream and holler because we have the right to kill children, human beings.
50 years of hollow and deceptive philosophy.
That's right.
Somehow thinking that makes sense.
Surely the human race would never turn on the most vulnerable of all of us. It's when we were little children, babies in the womb. You say, surely you wouldn't get a bunch that say we have to kill. And I know I've never seen people so animated about it.
No.
They're screaming at the top of their lungs, and a lot of what they're saying, you're like, you talk about hollow and deceptive philosophy.
It's
like a veil over them. They just can't see through it.
But I'm saying in this
hang on, Jason, take a break.
In this context, when he said, see that people don't deceive you, when you go back and say it, when he says, I tell you this in 2:4, what he just told them was, I want you to know in verse 1 of chapter 2, it says, I want you to know how much I'm struggling for you and for those at Laodicea. That's why I went back and read that. Well, this is that lukewarm bunch that the world had just made them. I mean, I don't even know what the word is. What is the spiritual equivalent to lukewarm?
Well, you look like, there's no difference.
You're going through the motions.
Right.
Without Jesus.
Jesus.
Because if you don't have Jesus, you don't have a purpose. Mm-hmm. That eliminates your purpose. And your future is now in question, because he's the only one that promises life after death. So it says, and for all who have not met me personally, my purpose is that they may be encouraged in heart and united in love, so that they may have the full riches of complete understanding, in order that they may know the mystery of God, namely Christ, the one knocking at the door of their building.
See, this was a lot more embraced, a letter like this to Colossae for Christian people, because the question would be, well, why would the founders, our founding fathers, why wouldn't they put in the Constitution, by the way, never turn on your children and kill them. You know what I think? I think they never thought humanity would stoop that low.
Yeah, it wouldn't even be something.
I don't think they had in mind, we'll get to a point within 200 years here to where they'll turn on their own children and slaughter them. I don't even think the founders thought we would ever reach that low down and sorry and murderous people that we are. I mean, last week, it's something like over 100 were shot dead. I throw in the little supermarket, throw that in there, and the church out there in California. But you say there was another 90,
in cities,
80 or 90 that was slaughtered in the streets of America.
Right.
You're like, what is this? When you see that much death and that much murder, whether it be infants or on the streets of a major city, when you see that kind of stuff, you can know Satan is having a field day.
He's alive and well.
Well, when you read James 1:13, it kind of gives you the picture of how you get to that point, because it says, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. After desire gives birth to sin.
Yep.
Sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death.
Yep.
Spiritually and sometimes physically, to your point. But watch what he says in the next verse. Don't be deceived. We're getting back to this deceit, which I know started in the garden. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who doesn't change like shifting shadows. And this goes back to what we talked about last podcast. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be kind of a first fruit.
There you go.
Well, if Jesus is the firstborn of all the creation, the point I was making about he's given us the right to become sons and daughters of God, we become the first fruits of what he created.
Correct.
Through the new birth. Which
he's laying the foundation, and so was Paul to the Colossians and James. You say they all start with the bedrock. Jesus, his death, burial, and resurrection. The word of truth. Short message. It's not long and drawn out. Colossians got it in one day from Epaphras. Since the day you heard it.
Isn't it Peter that gives you that picture that it's a foundation?
Yep.
Starts with Jesus, then they build on it, and it's like a spiritual house.
Yep.
Is his description of it. And we're just like bricks that keep being added into the building.
Yeah. I think, though, when you go back, when you try to define deceit, the evil one, what he did, because we just read where sin comes from. It's a process that starts in our mind. But in the case of the garden, the evil one took something good and turned it bad. I mean, he was basing everything, his whole argument and thought process, he would take something good and he was wanting to turn it into bad. You go back and read it. There was a lot of positives.
The promise was, the lie was, and you'll be like God.
Yeah.
Yeah. Without God.
Without him.
Now, they didn't put that in there, but you'll have the knowledge of
what
God.
What he's actually saying is you'll be your own God.
But you'll have the knowledge of God without God.
So,
Yeah.
That was the part he left out, because that's what it means to be alienated from God.
Right.
When you become your own God, which that's the point I wanted to make, because when you read Hebrews 5, I think something we take for granted is the ability to distinguish good from evil. I mean, which is the world's oldest trick. And I did it when I was a kid. When you do something wrong and you're confronted about it, your best excuse is say, well, I didn't know it was wrong. I didn't know that was wrong.
yeah.
I mean, how you going to punish me? I didn't know.
Well, how many people have been pulled over and said, and some state trooper says, "Here's what you did," and you're like, "Well, I didn't know. I didn't know the speed limit changed. I didn't know that this, that, or the other." I mean, does that get you off the hook?
Yeah.
No.
Which I think in this setting in Colossians, they're all sitting in the church building, and somebody's knocking at the door, and they're like, "Well, who's that?" when they're like, "Where's Jesus?" So, well, what's he want? We're not. Oh, we're doing something wrong here. I mean, it's the same.
Yeah.
Because you justified it in your mind. But
Let's take our last break, Jeff.
I think this is an interesting passage about growing in Jesus. I don't mean just growing in your relationship, not being duped into trying to attain, the knowledge of God or being your own God without God being the filter. But Hebrews 5:11 says, "We have much to say about this, but it's hard to explain because you're slow to learn. In fact, though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you the elementary truths of God's word all over again. You need milk, not solid food." Which is why I went here, because it reminds me of what's going on in Colossae. "Anyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is not acquainted with the teaching about righteousness, but solid food is for the mature." And here's the key phrase: "who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good and evil." Well, you wouldn't think it'd be hard to distinguish good from evil. But it is real hard when you're being deceived. Oh. So we'll read that verse as the acts of sinful nature are obvious. Well, it is obvious once you do the act. I mean, you pretty well know in your mind, in your conscience.
Right.
But leading up to it, that's when it gets blurry. Well, that's where the deceit comes in. It's always murky in that moment. And look.
Yeah, so Jase, we were just had, Elise and I were doing premarital counseling with a young couple. And, obviously, this young couple are both believers, and so they've made a commitment that they didn't want to have sex before they got married. And I said, if for that to happen, you've got to be very deliberate in how you date and how you go forward before you get to that day. Because if you just get in situations and then just let biology run its course, I mean, you'll fail over and over and over again without that deliberate idea. And so it's kind of what you're describing.
By the way, it's a lot more organized than you think it is. When John the Apostle was writing 1st, 2nd John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, chapter 2, he said, "Dear children, this is the last hour. As you've heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many antichrists have come." And he's talking to them at Colossae. Don't let anybody use deceptive and hollow philosophy. This is how we know it's the last hour. They went out from us, but they did not really belong to us. For if they had belonged to us, they would have remained with us. But their going showed that none of them belonged to us. But you have an anointing from the Holy One, and all of you know the truth. I don't write this to you because you do not know the truth, but because you do know it, and no lie comes from the truth. Who's the liar? It's the man who denies that Jesus is the Christ. Such a man is the Antichrist. He denies the Father and the Son. No one who denies the Son has the Father. Whoever acknowledges the Son has Father, has the Father also. So he went on over there, and said, this is how you can recognize the Spirit of God. Every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. There's always, the bedrock is laid on who Jesus is, the God who became flesh. Many way back there, and to this day, they're saying, impossible, no way.
Well, that's what people they forget, that for the sin to happen in the garden, the humans had to kick God out of the garden.
Right.
You're like, well, they can't kick him out. Well, they did. In that moment, they kicked him. They weren't acknowledging his presence.
Yeah.
I know one thing, we've had a lot of trouble ever since, Jase.
In fact, they thought they could hide from him.
They hid from him, which validates my point. And also with Jesus, you know why he's knocking on the door? Because some of them had kicked him out.
That's right. Exactly.
But they didn't do it obviously. It just happened, I think, the same way in the garden, where you start asking the wrong questions and you listen to the wrong voices.
Right.
And you rationalize.
And you're right. If this could happen in the first century,
Yep.
so closely, I mean, where people actually were still around, a few of them.
This has been going on for 2 millenniums.
Now we're talking about a couple thousand years.
Yep.
How easy is it for churches to not realize that Jesus is not leading the training?
Well, and what are churches? I mean, he says it here. We're members of the body. He is the head of the body, the church. The body's not going to function real well if it's not unified.
Yeah.
I mean,
Jace,
you can have a more drastic illustration of that.
There's a mighty throng of various churches scattered across the earth. Trust me when I tell you this, Chase. They're not going to invite you to talk to them.
No, that's right.
You just don't look like you got it together, Chase.
I know. And my point is, look, that's like severing your pinky and just putting it to the side and said,
We don't need that.
we don't need that. And then they go down the road and they meet somebody else. So guess what? There went a little toe.
That's right.
But at some point, the more you alienate the body, it just becomes a bunch of body parts that are scattered everywhere. Well, then that's creepy.
Right.
And what are you, a serial killer or the body of Christ? You know.
Well, and if you look at America herself, it's just one country, one place. But just over our short history, because we haven't been around that long.
Not at all.
But there were at least 3, I think, different revivals, awakenings, where a lot of people came to Christ and said, man, we got to get this thing going. I mean, after the Civil War, it's like, what are we doing? I mean, we're killing ourselves. And so every time we've had a return to godliness, for the most part, as a nation, we've had great blessing and success. But then it just goes right back into this.
That's it.
Because of the deceiver. Jace is right. I mean, so
and us listening to the deceiver. Because, I
You
mean,
don't
we're not
even
just talking about other
recognize
people.
evil as evil and good as good, going back to the Hebrews 5 there. If you're having trouble even recognizing what good and evil is, you're on a road to hell.
You got to remember that it comes to every individual. I mean, we all are sinners.
correct.
And so when it says the evil one's the father of all lies, you know what
Yep.
that means? Well, he's got some sons
Yeah.
That's
doing
right.
some work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know?
Remember John 8? When Jesus was looking, he says, "Your father is the devil." That's harsh.
Yep.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
But it was true.
'Cause they were spreading this same kind of
Exactly.
nonsense, deceit.
Well, the good news is that, and we're just in the first, chapter of this book, which is a short book, but he's going to really get into the riches of it in the next
He
chapter.
got personal right here.
He did.
He's like, now look, he talked about how great he heard about him as a body, and here's Jesus. Then he said, now look, you were once alienated and enemies, and because he's going to bring up that deceitful philosophy that's coming back into their lives again,
Right.
post Jesus.
Yep.
Which is scary. It's a scary thought for us. But
It
look,
is.
the evil one's not going to give up, and that's just the way it is.
And you're right. The fact that it was the sister church in the sister city that we read about what happened to them in Revelation, I mean, it's hitting close to home, when Paul writes this book and writes this letter to
I
these.
mean, the moral of the story is you don't want to be in church and have Jesus knocking at the door saying, let me in. And then once he gets in, you don't want him saying, look, you make me sick.
That's
You don't want that.
That's too,
Those two things that by your life and philosophy you want to avoid.
That's right. Two things you don't want to have. We're out of time. We're going to shift over to overtime, and we'll kind of finish up this passage. We got a special guest coming into a surprise guest, Jace, into our next podcast for our audience. So we'll see you in the overtime to finish this up in Colossians 1 and 2.
Thanks for listening to the Unashamed podcast. Help us out by rating us on iTunes. And don't miss an episode by subscribing on YouTube, and be sure to click that little bell to get notified about new episodes. And for even more content that you won't get anywhere else, subscribe to Blaze TV at blazetv.com/unashamed.